Next speaker is Prof. Glasziou, who is Director of the Center for Research in Evidence-Based Practices, Bond University. His key interests include identifying and removing barriers to using high-quality research, as well as reducing waste in research. And he will talk with us about opportunities for linking evidence development to reimbursement in Australia. Paul.
Thanks very much, Ben. And I have been slightly tempted to cut this short by just saying whatever John Symes said. But I'll actually say the same things, but in a slightly different way and with a few different examples. So the first thing I should declare is, as well as being at Bond University, I'm also a member of the MBS Review Task Force, and there's a working group of that I'm chairing that is looking at how clinical research, in particular trials and registries, might be helpful in answering MBS relevant questions. But I'll have to say I'm mostly here for intelligence because that work is just getting underway. We've just been sort of scoping what needs to be done and realising that it's a fairly large task. I just wanted to begin by mentioning there was a series that we did on waste in research in the Lancet a couple of years ago that documented the 85% waste that occurs in research at the moment. But it's this third one here, the efficient research regulation and delivery, that I wanted to mention. And in particular, this recommendation 4, which has actually been mentioned several times today, but it says everyone, particularly those responsible for healthcare systems, should help improve the efficiency of clinical research through the promotion of the integration of research into everyday clinical practice. And I think we've heard that said, as I say, several times in the day. It mentions some historical examples of this, like the Glasziou collaboration and the initial plans of the UK National Health Service in 2000. But it goes on to talk about what we heard about earlier from Professor Cole about the way that this is just the way of doing business with childhood cancer, in particular childhood leukemia. And where there are failures, of course, later on in the young adults that we heard about. But that routine clinical trials are just how you do that in childhood oncology. So I'm going to begin with an Australian example just to illustrate that the issues of trying to reimburse and help payers helping to fund the research is actually quite old, and this goes back to the ANBP2, the Australian National Blood Pressure 2, which asks the question about ACE inhibitors versus diuretics. This is a graph showing when the study started the frequency of the usage of different drugs, with ACE inhibitors being the most common and diuretics being one of the least common, with the ACE2s and beta blockers being here. Angiotensins being down here. So the study compared ACE inhibitors and diuretics, and one of the big breakthroughs, I think, was that it managed to get this approved by the PBS for routine funding. That is, all of the drugs in both arms are actually funded by the PBS. Now, why was the PBS interested in doing this? Because it saved money. ACE inhibitors were actually more widely used than diuretics, and diuretics were dirt cheap. And so whatever the result of the trial, at least during the trial, the PBS was actually saving money by only having 50% of people on ACE inhibitors, which were expensive at the time. So here's a case where the trial was starting to pay for itself to the PBS during the conduct without even getting results, which is pretty amazing. The research costs, of course, were covered by the NHMRC and Merck Sharp Dome at the time. And I think I've drawn these as very clear boundaries, but actually when you start to think through what the separate compartments are, it starts to get very fuzzy, such as additional tests that you might do, additional drugs, routine visits, etc. So the general idea of coverage with evidence development, that is in a sense one example of, is where the health payer would cover the target treatment and sometimes the comparator treatment, but the research costs would generally be covered by somewhere else. There has to be a research funder for this thing to work. And in Australia, that might look like this, that the MBS or the PBS, states, insurers, etc. might cover these treatments, and the research costs then would have to come out of somewhere else, like the MRFF, the Department of Health, or NHMRC. John Symes, interestingly, pointed out that since the department would be saving by not funding the comparator treatment for the target group who are getting the alternative treatment, that there should be a reimbursement for the costs of the comparator treatment to the group that was funding this. So there are, as I said, a number of funders. The MRFF might be one of these potential funders, and from the strategy document that's just been released, it says the MRFF has an important role to play in facilitating non-commercial clinical trials. They mention commercial ones in other places, but this was specifically mentioning non-commercial clinical trials of potential significance, and that the MRFF would support clinical trial networking infrastructure that we've heard so much about today. In the priorities document, remember there's a 5-year strategy and a 2-year priorities. It mentions building evidence in primary care, but it specifically mentions working alongside the medical benefits schedule review task force to identify those areas where there are uncertainties that may require randomised controlled trials to be done. As I said, this isn't a particularly new idea. Coverage with evidence development has gone on in a variety of places around the world. This was a review that was done in Canada who are interested in the area and have actually been one of the leaders. This is the examples by country, and you can see there's a lot of coverage here, with Australia being actually one of the least users of this type of process. One example being the use of Bosentan by the PBS. One of the other interesting things, though, in this data is the wide use of non-drug therapy. So about half of these studies have been for drugs, but half of them have been for non-drug treatments of some sort. And I just wanted to mention one example of that that I'm reasonably familiar with, which is the blood glucose monitoring study that was funded by the HTA program in the UK for looking at non-insulin dependent diabetes. So if you're insulin dependent, there's pretty clear evidence that blood glucose monitoring works, but more controversial was whether blood glucose monitoring worked if you were not insulin dependent. So there had been some small but pretty poor quality trials, and they decided to fund the definitive trial, 450 patients in 3 arms. Results at 12 months showed no difference in hemoglobin A1C for any of the 3 arms, which were no glucose monitoring, less intensive and more intensive. And these are clinically unimportant differences that weren't clinically significant. But there was actually worse quality of life, a tendency to increased anxiety in those undergoing intensive monitoring. Now, we've heard a lot about the cost effectiveness of clinical trials, but I think this one probably takes the record. The cost of the trial here was £0.5 of £1 million. The annual cost of the UK strips was £100 million per year. So even with Steve Webb's, 63% penetrance or whatever, I think this would still only take about a month to repay itself. So the gains of this were pretty substantial. And if you go global with this, the worldwide costs were estimated in 2008 to be about $8 billion a year. So this was an extremely cost-effective trial to do. The UK HTA program in general, though, funds things that are important to the NHS. They cover both the costs but also the research costs, because they see the economic sense in this and want to fund the whole lot. But the process for doing that is actually quite complicated, and apparently it takes from the stage of the suggestion of the question to the completion of the trial, the average is about 8 years. They've had 100 completed trials and currently have about 200 in progress. The sources of those questions come from wide consultation through priority setting processes, but also directly with users like NICE. A lot of them come from systematic reviews, particularly Cochrane and the Horizon Scanning Centre. This is the complexities of the process, though, because they want to filter down to the sorts of very high value, important questions that are worth answering for the NHS in general. And those are of 2 types. A lot of them are commissioned research. That is, things that priority setting processes have decided would be very good value for money, but increasingly there are researcher-led ones too, but they have to go through the same process of being approved as being high value for money. Before I close, I just wanted to mention that a lot of those will actually be old treatments. So we think of coverage with evidence development as being for new treatments, but it may also be for new indications. One example of this issue is aspirin, which was originally found for fever. That was the willow bark, but then for arthritis and then for antiplatelet drugs in the 1950s. And probably most recently, there's Peter Rothwell's reviews suggesting aspirin is reducing colorectal cancer as well. So aspirin just keeps giving in the way that it has new uses. And actually, that's the norm. So the FDA probably approves far more things that are new uses of old existing chemical agents than it does approve new chemical agents. This is just one example for looking at cardiology drugs from 1991 through to 2013, and the blue is the new uses, the red is the new molecular entities. And you can see the majority here are actually new uses of old drugs. And that doesn't count off-label things. These are things that are being used and approved by the FDA processes. So coming back then to the MBS and what sorts of things they might be looking at, both drug and non-drug. As we heard from Steve Webb this morning, the uncertainties about old treatments is probably our biggest problem, and there are a lot of those arising in the MBS review, and the monitoring is one example of that, and there are several other monitoring examples that have come up. Then there are head-to-head comparisons. Which of these two treatments that are being funded to old treatments are actually the most effective? There are new indications for old treatments, and they're probably the most common. There would possibly be some new treatments, but that's actually covered by MSAC processes rather than the MBS review. And the fifth interesting one that's come up is behavioural questions. So one example of this was the issue of whether giving providers cost information about the alternatives before they ordered a test or ordered a prescription would change what they did. And in fact, there's a systematic review of the controlled trials that has been done suggesting, at least in some circumstances, that that does change ordering and lower the costs. So just in summary then, the sorts of things that we're looking at within the MBS review process are that we think it's a good idea that there should be, out of the review processes, there should be research questions that get answered, but they should be resulting in new generalisable information. That is, the proper research that would be transferable not just to Australia, but probably to many countries. And the research might include a whole range of things. It's not just about clinical trials. It included discussion of other observational studies that we might get. For sometimes it's just diagnostic yield that we want to know, but others would be answered by the sorts of registry issues that we heard about today. For example, the orthopaedics and the types of prosthesis that you put in. But there's a whole series of questions that we need to be answering within the next 6 months, which will come out in the final report, which is how the research costs might be resourced. And that one possibility obviously is the MRFF. And the second one is the one that John Symes had covered, which was this question selection. He told us about the NHMRC criteria, but the key criteria, I think, for the MBS task force would be the value for information. That is this a big problem? How much would it cost to do the research, and how much of that uncertainty could it remove? What would be the potential gain from doing this? So as I say, we're just in a sense starting this process, and if you have suggestions and ideas for this process and things that we might address, please feel free to contact me at that email address. Thank you.